Hello, everyone. My name is Yusuf. I'm with the Adalah-NY Coalition for Justice in the Middle East. I'd like to welcome everyone today for today's event, Target Iran, What's at Stake for the Middle East. But first off, I just wanted to let everyone know who Adalah is and what we do. Adalah means justice in Arabic, and we're a coalition of organizations and individuals here in New York. We were originally formed in response to the escalation of the attacks, the Israeli attacks against Gaza, and the subsequent Israeli attacks and invasion of Lebanon in the summer of 2006. We've organized or have been part of several demonstrations at the Israeli consulate, at the United Nations, at all the major anti-war demonstrations in DC over the last year. We've also organized local marches here in New York across the Brooklyn Bridge, in Astoria, Queens, in Times Square. We've also last summer met with the Office of the UN Secretary General and delivered a petition signed by over 1,000 individuals and organizations demanding an immediate end to Israeli aggression against Palestine and Lebanon. So while, obviously we think that protest is very important, we also think it's critical for us to understand, discuss, and educate ourselves and people around us about what's happening in the Middle East, the situation there, and what's going on, which is why we're holding this event here today. If you like what you hear, if you like what you see, if you want to help us organize more protests, more educational events, more panels, more teach-ins, and more stuff like that, please sign up on our mailing list. It should have been going around, and it's also outside. You can also check out our website at www.mideastjustice.org, and also come to our next organizing meeting, which will be Monday, April 2nd, in a couple of days, at Judson Memorial Church, which is on 239 Thompson, just south of Washington Square Park. It's at 7 p.m. So that's happening. First of all, I'd like to thank all the sponsoring organizations that have worked with Adalah and helped us put this event together. I'd like to thank the International Socialist Organization and the ISO Club at CUNY Graduate Center, the Westpac Foundation, the New York Campaign for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Against Israel, Socialist Action, Action Wednesdays Against the War, and the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran. I'd also like to thank the speakers, Hamid Dabashi, Fawwaz Traboulsi, Ervand Abrahamian, and Saman Sepehri, for being here today and taking time out of their busy schedule to participate in this discussion with us. So I'd like to introduce our chairperson for today, Lady Kashani. She's been a crucial part of helping pull this together with us. She's worked very closely with Adalah in organizing this. Layli is a PhD student in the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. She's also the senior editor at the Arab Studies Journal, and she has been a student council member at the International Society for Iranian Students. Layli.
Welcome everyone again to this very timely event in which we gather to discuss escalating US-led threats of war and deepening sanctions against Iran. This forum was organized with the aim of both furthering understanding of the current crisis and equally crucially to contribute to thinking through what conscientious people in the United States can do to resist the war from spreading to Iran. During the talks and discussion, we hope to contextualize this crisis against developments in the broader Middle East and assess what further aggression would mean for the people of the region and our collective futures and safety. Our speakers, I will introduce them more fully before each of them speaks, but to give you a layout of what the afternoon will look like, we will start with Professor Ervand Abrahamian, who will provide some historical background to the US-Iran conflict, trace the nuclear negotiations, and update us on the latest developments. We will follow by Professor Fawwaz Traboulsi, who will illuminate for us how various Arab governments, media, and intellectuals are addressing the escalating US-Iran conflict. and in particular speak about the U.S.'s new shifting policies towards supporting so-called moderate Arab regimes. Well, we will follow by Professor Hamid Dabashi, who will discuss the nexus between Iranian and Arab and Muslim native informants and human rights groups who claim expert knowledge about the region, but either clamor for war or make themselves useful to warmongers by neglecting to consistently say that they oppose war and sanctions, and neglect to expose and condemn U.S. crimes at the same time that they expose the repressiveness of Middle Eastern governments. So Professor Dabashi will help us think through what solidarity with social justice activists in Iran and the larger Middle East would look like. And we will end with Saman Sepehri, who will address how and why Iran has become a dominant regional power, and will also help us understand the heterogeneity or the diversity of struggles inside Iran, of Iranian society, and the various splits and dynamism of the Iranian government itself, so we can have a better understanding of what's happening on the ground in Iran. So again, without further ado, welcome again, and I will present to you our first speaker, Ervand Abrahamian. He is a distinguished professor of history at the City University of New York and is among the most prominent and prolific scholars of modern Iran. His books include Iran Between Two Revolutions, The Iranian Mujahideen, Khomeiniism, Essays on the Islamic Republic, Tortured Confessions, and a co-authored work titled Inventing the Axis of Evil, The Truth About North Korea, Iran, and Syria. He is currently working on 2 books for Cambridge University Press, one on the CIA coup in Iran, and the other a general history of modern Iran. Professor Abrahamian has been a regular commentator on Iran and the Middle East in the press.
When General Gardner, you remember he was the first American proconsul in Baghdad, returned to Washington, he gave a briefing to Bush about what was going on in Iraq. Bush was actually very unconcerned about what was happening in Iraq. Already by then, actually, things were unraveling, but he was not really interested about Iraq. The only question he had for General Gardner was, are you ready to invade Iran? And General Gardner's response was actually very indicative. He said, yes, of course I am, but I'd rather invade Cuba first. So these guys had a whole list of countries they were going to take out. In fact, before the invasion of Iraq, the neocon joke in Washington was that all men want to go to Baghdad, but only real men want to go to Tehran. So I think there's a long-standing sort of impulse, desire to deal with Iran, and I'm not really going to deal with the motives for that, or what is the driving force. I want to actually look at basically the possibilities of attack now, and the general complacency that there is that that it's unlikely that there will be a war with Iran. The complacency you'll find, I think it very much in the media, also in the general public, is based on 3 arguments. And on surface, each of the arguments seem pretty convincing, but then look closer and see what the reasons that the arguments actually will not hold up. One major argument is, of course, that the United States is already overextended, and therefore it would not venture into another war. When Ahmadinejad, the Iranian president, was here, he was asked whether he was worried about a US attack, and his response was that no sane person would dare attack Iran. And his presumption, of course, was the US is so overextended in the quagmire of Iraq that he wouldn't expand the war. A second argument is that the public, the American public, would not stand it, and there would be enough opposition in Congress, especially from the Democrats, that would prevent the expansion of the war, and therefore we can be rest assured that there's not likely to be an expansion. The third argument is that the neocons, who were, of course, very important in giving us Iraq, have more or less disappeared from Washington. And with their demise and the removal of people to elsewhere, people like Wolfowitz, White, and so on, Bolton, you can have a whole list of them. Those people are not there to push for a war on Iran. Now, as I said, all these arguments sound pretty persuasive, except for, if you look at them more closely, unfortunately, they're not that convincing. First argument, that US is overreached. Yes, if we're talking about invasion of Iran, a land invasion, of course, the US wouldn't even think of that because Iran is an impossible geographical country and too large to occupy. But I don't think anyone in Washington is thinking of invasion, but of airstrikes. And with airstrikes, all you need is the Air Force and the Navy. Two sections of the military that have not been involved really in the war so far. And in fact, they will be more than eager to get some of the action. So far, it's the Marines and the Army who have basically done the fighting. And these two sections of the military have been on the sidelines. And of course, if Bush asks the Air Force or the Navy, are you capable of doing this? They would, of course, say yes. They would be more than eager to carry out the airstrikes. In fact, the appointment of a U.S. admiral to head the U.S. military force in the Middle East, which has never happened before, but 2 months ago, an admiral was appointed to the command of the military, is an indication that, in fact, the Air Force and the Navy are going to be in charge. In the last weeks, actually, the U.S. Navy has been reinforced in the Gulf. The U.S. has a greater presence now in the Gulf than ever before, even greater than during the Gulf War. The other argument about the military is that Iran has the capability of inflicting military damage on the United States, so that there's a lot of talk about Iran now as a sort of a third Reich with unlimited power. This is quite effective in getting the American public worried about so-called Iranian hegemony. Even Kissinger uses the word Iranian imperialism in the region. But in fact, the Iranian army, military, has absolutely no offensive capabilities. Its air force is 30 years obsolete. It has no navy. It would have very little resistance to airstrikes. So that if the U.S. wanted to carry out airstrikes on the facilities, this would be quite easy to do, feasible to do, and I would imagine quite tempting to do. Second argument is that the Democrats, the Congress, would oppose it because of war weariness here. And here again, just last week, when the Democrats had the option of putting a clause in that Bush would have to go to Congress to get approval for airstrikes, they decided not to put it in. This, to me, is a clear green light to the administration that if they want to have airstrikes, the Congress might protest or may make some noises, but they're not actually going to stop such a venture. The third argument, the neocons. It's true many of the neocons have gone to better places, but the real two people who were very much in favor of dealing with Iran are still there, namely Cheney and Bush. And the driving force was I would say, still very much present, especially from Cheney's office, to deal with what they call the Iranian problem. In fact, it sounds like Bush has given assurances to Israel that before he leaves office, he will deal with the Iranian problem. Both Obert and Netanyahu have told the press that Bush has given them the assurance that he will solve this problem before he leaves office. And since Bush flatters himself that he never basically goes back on his promises, this is something to be taken seriously. Now, there are two ways of really dealing with the problem. The Iranian problem is the nuclear problem. There are two ways of dealing with it. One is, of course, through negotiations. The other way would be through airstrikes. Since negotiations have been mixed, and now we know quite well that Iranians in 2003 offered to negotiate everything across the board, and it was the administration that rejected the possibility of negotiations, then it's clear that this is not the route they want to follow. In addition to another evidence that the administration does not want to follow the negotiation routes is just last year when Gates came into office, the report about how to deal with the crisis, they suggested the Republican graybeards really recommended negotiations, and again Bush rejected the negotiations. So if you reject one route, the other route obviously left is a question of airstrikes. Now, there is still, of course, I would say in the media and the public would be concerned about expansion of the war. But if the war is presented in such a way that it's a quick surgical strikes, airstrikes, 4 or 5 days, which will solve the problem, i.e. get rid of all the nuclear installations, this could easily be sold to the American public as basically a limited, not a war. In fact, the way they use the language is interesting. They always assure the press that the US is not planning to invade or carry out a land movement into Iran, or they even say we're not planning a war. But from their point of view, airstrikes would not be war, it would be something else. They've been using the language, English language, in very creative manner for the last 6 years. So they could be very much thinking that this would not be a question of declaration of war, but surgical strikes. And of course, this could be done very much towards the end of the administration, where US would carry out airstrikes. You would have impressive pictures on the front pages of installations destroyed, and the president could declare mission accomplished. And this would be quite convincing to most of the American public, because who's to know actually what the damage was, how successful or not. But of course, this also doesn't take into account the consequences, because something like this can be presented to the public as a limited action success without the public being aware of what the consequences are. I do Orientalist history, and there's an old sort of concept among Orientalists that Oriental people don't link cause and effect. And nowadays you can say actually Occidental people don't link cause and effect. So nowadays we've had the invasion of Iraq and the chaos there, and people don't actually link it to the invasion. They say, well, if this or that had been done, something, or if it's due to other reasons. Similarly with invasion, airstrikes on Iran, the consequences are quite obvious, but people will not basically link the cause and effect. What are the consequences? Well, it's not going to destroy the Iranian regime. It would harden the Iranian regime. They will automatically arrest any critics. In fact, there will be very few critics because even the people who oppose the regime will rally around the regime. And the regime, if it's sensible, will strike the United States where it's strongest and where the United States is weakest, which is basically in Afghanistan and Iraq. In both places, they don't have military overreach to actually challenge the United States, but there are plenty of people in both countries who would love to have Iranian assistance in terms of equipment to challenge the United States. Both in Iraq and Afghanistan, Iran has really the last few years tried to cool things down and implicitly actually help the United States to stabilize the situation. They could reverse policy they would reverse policy immediately as soon as there were airstrikes and support Saad in carrying out attacks on the United States. So the net result would be basically unraveling of the US position in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And the US Marines and Army are quite aware of that, but they're not part of the decision making. The decision making would be Cheney, Bush, the Air Force and Navy. The consequences would be, of course, drastic. I think there are people like Brzezinski, former national security advisor, who have basically told the Senate committees that airstrikes will really lead to a 30-year war or a 100-year war, because with the expansion of the war, basically, the US would have to reintroduce the draft, to have an army of about 2 to 3 million to deal with an extended crisis all over the region, with dealing with insurgents, especially Shia insurgents, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. But that wouldn't really deter this administration, because that wouldn't be the problem for this administration. By then, Bush would have left office. It would be some other administration that would have to pick up the mess. And as I said, since people don't link cause and effect, it would be argued that, well, it was the fault of the next administration that they did this and that. If they'd only taken wiser decisions, this would not have happened. And the airstrikes themselves were successful because we have all the pictures with the destroyed installations. So I think there is a real danger of airstrikes, and people like Hirsch, who've been arguing this for quite some time, and they've been usually poo-pooed in the mainstream media as being alarmist, have the evidence. And of course what he gets is information about the preparations. So the argument is, well, the military is always being prepared for contingencies. They're not going to put it into effect because it doesn't make sense. Logically, it wouldn't make sense to do it. Yes, it's true if you're thinking in long-term logic, but you're thinking in terms of political short-term interest, the administration could very well do it before it leaves office. I'll stop there.
Terribly sorry, engrossed in Ervand's lecture myself. I have managed to misplace my own papers. And I would not want to do any injustice to our next speaker, Fawwaz Traboulsi, because he is a leading Lebanese academic and public intellectual. He is a professor of history and political science at the Lebanese American University in Beirut, and is a visiting professor at Columbia University. Before becoming an academic, he was a prominent journalist and has written extensively on history, Arab politics, social movements, Orientalism, and popular culture. His widely acclaimed book, A History of Modern Lebanon, was just published this January by Pluto Press. And Fawwaz's other books, many other books, only a few of which I list here, include On an Incurable Hope, a journal of the Siege of Beirut, from the summer of 1982, Guernica, Beirut, Picasso mural, An Arab City in War, a pivotal book on Adan, Yemen Diary, an Arabic translation of Edward Said's Out of Place, The Stranger, the Treasure, and the Miracle, and a translation into Arabic of Edward Said's posthumous work, Humanism and Democratic Critique. Welcome.
Thank you. Being the only Arab on the panel, I'm here mainly out of solidarity with the Iranian people. So you'll understand why I'm emphasizing this. I think when you read about Sunnis and Shias, Arabs and Kurds, Arabs and Iranians, etc. But let me, since I'm supposed to ask, to answer the questions concerning the Arab region, the Arab world, let me try and talk about two alternatives at least. The war alternative, which we've just heard about, and another possibility, which does not preclude the war, but has already started, and has to do with this idea of Ms. Condoleezza Rice concerning Arab moderates and Arab and non-Arab extremists. In fact, this was the product of the post-Israeli war against Lebanon, which was last summer, as you know, and that famous statement by Ms. Rice that that war was the birth pangs of a new Middle East. Now, of course, we've been having Middle East, new Middle East, greater Middle East as much as you want in the past few years. But what I'm interested in is one issue that is very important in the Arab world is very simple. How come Israel has 200 nuclear heads, has just confessed to them, and Iran has no right to have even a peaceful nuclear development. That is one very important question that's raised in the Arab world, and it so happens the only one who's ventured to ask it, and I'll talk mainly about him, is of course Professor Bernard Lewis. Now, there are variations of Orientalism, but I think we have entered a new phase, which is in between senile Orientalism and divinatory Orientalism. Unless you consider me trying to be nasty, just listen to one of the latest articles by Professor Lewis concerning Iran. And that's the title. I don't know if many of you would have known about it, but August 22nd is the title. Does Iran have something in store? Wall Street Journal, that was on the 8th of August 2006. Now, that was during the war in Lebanon. And the date of August 22nd is the contribution of Professor Lewis to what I call divinatory Orientalism, which is his guess that Ahmadinejad had put that date for concerning the negotiations about nuclear Iran, because that was supposed to be the end of time. And in fact, Bernard Lewis's answer to the question, why should Israel have nuclear weapons and Iran should not, is that the rulers of Iran believe in some form of millenarian happening. Now, Mr. Lewis says on the sides that, of course, all religions have millenarian waitings for some return of the Messiah. He does mention Magog and whatever. He also mentions Armageddon, but of course does not mention that Armageddon is believed by some 20 million Americans, and that it implies killing at least half of the Jews of the world. That is not mentioned in the article. But what is mentioned in the article is that, of course, the rulers of Iran believe in the coming of the Mahdi. And that is the main argument for not giving Iran the right to have peaceful nuclear development. Now, to that point, the article is fine, I mean, apart from the fact that we waited for the 22nd of August, the end of time did not happen, and so we continue reading the article, and the article now talks about something totally different, which is that Muslims who kill each other, who kill fellow Muslims, now have the right to heaven. Now, where did Professor Lewis get that? I don't know. But as far as I know, for example, Sayyid Qutb would allow a Muslim to kill a Kafir Muslim. Sayyid Qutb does not by any measure represent all of Islam, and Sayyid Qutb would be a Sunni mujtahid, and definitely, I mean, you can't impose on the Iranian leadership to believe in Sayyid Qutb. But the idea in the article is that mainly Muslims have this notion of killing, saving yourself by killing another Muslim, and of course the price is paradise. And that is equated in that article with jihad. Now here is something that to prove this, Bernard Lewis makes the following judgment, and I quote him. He says, "Kill them all. I mean, it's no problem. Allah will know His own. Allah will know His own. It's all right if you kill Muslims. Kill Muslims. God will separate good Muslims from bad Muslims." And I was wondering, this Allah will know His own. Where does it come from? And of course, it's never been mentioned in any Islamic text. But anybody who knows a little bit about Christianity would remember something exactly the same, but which has nothing to do with Allah. And this is a famous saying, which is, "Kill them all, God will recognize His own." And that comes from the Crusaders. And significantly enough, not from the Crusade, not from the Oriental Crusade. That comes from the Christian Crusade. That comes from the crusade that Pope Innocenti III waged against the Cathars of southern France, especially in their main city, Béziers. And then the leader of the killing was asked by his soldiers, how would we know the good Christians of Béziers and the bad Christians? And he told them, don't worry, kill them all. God would recognize His own. Of course, 20,000 of the Christians of Béziers were killed by this crusade. So here you have a very serious Orientalist, a very serious scholar now, who simply borrows, who's very meticulous about the differences between religions. Remember, he is the one who coined the term clash of civilization. And then he borrows from one religion like that and attributes it to another religion. That should tell you a lot about the validity and the scholarly capacities of Mr. Bernard Lewis. Now, that's not the end of it. The end of it is that what are the scenarios to deal with the Iranian nuclear weapons? And the blunt answer of Mr. Lewis is leave it to the Muslims. In so many words, let Muslims kill Muslims concerning this question. It so happens that a few weeks later, Ms. Rice came with this idea of the moderate camp against the extremists. The moderate camp was supposed to have all the democratic forces, of course, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and of course Israel. And the extremist camp is mainly headed by Iran. And I'm not introducing democracy for that reason. The question was asked by a naive Egyptian journalist, where is democracy in this? And she told him, the moderates will come around with time to democracy. So I leave you with this idea.
Sorry, the mic just went out. Can people hear me in the back?
Yeah.
It's back.
Next, I'd like to introduce Hamid Dabashi, who is a Kevorkian professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, New York. He has written, last I checked, 12 books, edited 4 and contributed chapters to many more. His highly acclaimed writings on Iran, medieval and modern Islam, comparative literature, world cinema, the philosophy of art include The Theology of Discontent, Close-Up Iranian Cinema, Past, Present, Future, Staging a Revolution, The Art of Persuasion in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and an edited volume, Dreams of a Nation on Palestinian Cinema. His most recent books published this year are Masters and Masterpieces of Iranian Cinema and Iran, A People Interrupted. Hamid is also a public speaker around the globe, a current affairs essayist, and a staunch anti-war activist. Welcome.
One of the things that I have been asked to talk about is solidarities across various colonially manufactured borders. And I'd like to start my talk by pointing out a number of them in a preliminary way. Number one is the organization that has hosted this Adalah. And Lady Kashani, who is our moderator, is one of the best examples of Iranian students activist who has crossed the colonially manufactured border between Iranians and Arabs. Adalah itself, in the two figures of Yusuf and Lady, shows how these colonially manufactured borders need to be crossed and for us to be able to mobilize sorts of resistances that this particular amorphous imperialism requires. Second, I'd like to recognize in the audience two wonderful, extraordinary students at Columbia University, Monique Dole, sitting right there, and David two of our heroic students who have just been reprimanded. And I, as a member of faculty at Columbia University, could not be more honored to be in the same campus with them for having resisted the racist, bigoted Minutemen who have been invited to Columbia. Had it not been for the extraordinary activism of Monique Dole and David Judd and their friends and comrades at Columbia University, we would not have, this city would not have known what atrocious criminal activities under the present regime, which is the sort of academic version of Newcons at Columbia, we are dealing with. A third example is Fawwaz Traboulsi. I want to share an anecdote for you to. Last July, late June, my wife and I were in Beirut. We were guests of Traboulsi's. And the night before we left, the four of us were watching, was a World Cup. We were watching Brazil and France, right? We were watching Brazil and France. And at the time I was copy editing one of my books, this masterpieces that David just mentioned, and I was so disheartened that Brazil lost, that I left my manuscript right where we were having sushis and beer and so forth. I just left it there. And the following day we just flew to New York. And as soon as we landed in New York, of course, the Israelis started bombing Lebanon. And among other things, I was very concerned about friends and colleagues and comrades in Lebanon. Now, just 24 hours before the Lebanese started bombing, I had emailed Fawwaz and I told Fawwaz that I left my manuscript there, would you please just FedEx it to me? So he emailed back and said, yeah, I FedEx it tomorrow. And then immediately before I received the manuscript, I wrote back immediately, Fawwaz, are you guys okay? Is everything okay? 2 days I don't hear anything, and the first email I received from Fawwaz, now it is like 3-4 days into massive bombardment of Beirut. He doesn't say anything about what's happening to him. He said, did you receive the manuscript? The resilience, this is the point is the resilience of the heroic people of Lebanon that cannot and will not be divided. Sunni Christian nonsense that in the figure of the public intellectuals that Fawwaz Traboulsi represents, you see evidence and a proof of that. The next is this issue of Kissinger that Fawwaz just, or I think it was Ervand, I forget, about, what did he say about Iran being imperialistic in the region? That's a splendid. See, this is the logic of Frank Miller and Zack Snyder's 300. You see, the way that this imperialism operates, United States acts like the army of Xerxes, but sees itself like the Spartans. Isn't that unbelievable? I mean, when you see this CGI-infested nonsense, just when the Xerxes army comes, that's the army of Attila the Hun. That's the army of shock and awe. Okay, that's the army of United States, the way it operates in the region. But the way that these teenage mutants want to see the world, they see themselves like the Spartans. Whereas the resistance in Iraq, the resistance in Palestine, the resistance in Iraq has far more claim to being a small band of revolutionaries resisting imperialism. I mean, this is the way that this contorted reality operates. Now, the other example that, again, was mentioned, the question of objecting to Iran having nuclear, despite the fact that Israelis are sitting on the most massive stockpile of nuclear armament. You see, in his utter stupidity, Ahmadinejad simply mentioned something about wiping Israel off the map of the earth, right? Which is a stupid thing to say. And no people, no country, no nation, nothing has to be wiped out of any map. But people get engaged into what did he exactly mean, what was the Persian original, how did it translate it into English. But the fact that in 34 days, Israel actually, factually, wipes out the entire economic and political infrastructure of a nation state is not an issue. That is not a matter. But mentioning it, however stupid, however wrong, that is a cause for mobilizing the army of Attila. Now, the other issue is Lewis's reference to Armageddon. Here I want to refer to a fantastic documentary made by a great Israeli filmmaker, Avi Maghribi, called Avenged by One of My Two Eyes, in which what Avi Maghribi does in a moment of cinematic genius is in fact uses the example of Masada and Samson as the first two examples of suicidal violence. Do you follow? In order to talk about the predicament of Palestinians. All we see visually are the predicament of Palestinians and their occupation, but all we hear are the narratives of Masada and of Armageddon. I'm offering these, and there are many other examples, it's just too many. I'm offering this as forms of resistances and solidarities that ought to be constructed across various borders, systematically dismantling them, consciously transgressing them, Arabs, Israelis, Iranians, Americans, etc., by way of a strategy of outmaneuvering what, after all, remember, are C students. A students and B students are right here. C students are ruling the world. Now, I have been asked to talk about the category of native informers. I recently, as you may know, wrote a piece, Native Informers and the Making of American Empire. And by way of connecting this very same Mr. Bernard Lewis that Fawwaz was talking about, is the person that Adalah-NY refers to. Thank you, Professor Lewis, for opening the door for me. And she also thanks Bernard Lewis for having taught her aspects of Islamic intellectual history that she says Muslims themselves didn't know. I mean, we're talking about rational realities. How could Muslims produce an intellectual history and not know that they have produced intellectual history? I mean, it's like playing, you're right here, we're having a shared experience, right? And then you go out and you say, somebody is telling you, an Orientalist comes and talks about, a journalist talks about this experience, and said, well, they didn't know themselves. Those who actually participated, that produced the reality, they didn't know. They had to wait for Bernard Lewis to come and tell them. Now, it is exceedingly important at this particular moment in this empire for us not to get personal and not to get angry. You don't get angry, you get even. You don't get personal, you theorize. I'm absolutely convinced that we are in a very particular moment in history. We are eyewitness of something extraordinary in American history that it has many reminiscences. For example, the link between domestic racism and external imperialism, that, as the case of the Minutemen clearly indicates, is exceedingly reminiscent of 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, the way the great theorists of the period, W.E.B. Du Bois, recognized the link between domestic racism and global imperialism. It is, so in that regard, we are, among us, we are the children of W.E.B. Du Bois. We have to know what it is that we are witnessing. The category of native informer, as a result, what I'm proposing, is a peculiar moment in a moment in the history of late capitalism that imperialism categorically lacks legitimacy, categorically lacks hegemony. And as a result, we have a number of guns for hires, okay? Mostly immigrant intellectuals. What I'm offering is in fact the shadow of what Edward Said called exilic intellectuals. You remember the late Edward Said, in his book on intellectuals, he says that the best condition for the intellectual to be is to be in exile. He gives the example of Adorno, he gives, from literature, he gives the example of Bazarov, that no intellectual should be at home even when he is at home. So for example, Chomsky, despite the fact that he is American, he is exiled. Or the same thing is with Adorno, the same is with C. Wright Mills, that you're never at the center, you're always at the periphery. The hidden shadow of the notion of the exilic intellectual is the comprador intellectual, is the native informer. Namely, an international free trade zone in which expatriate intellectuals come here and they sell their services for the best bid. People like Fawwaz Traboulsi, like Adalah-NY, like Hirsi Ali, like who else? Ibn Wahb, as we say, Novarab. These are people who have come here. They have no organic link to anything. And in fact, the notion of exile, that is, when they have left home, they have a notion of a vagabond life, which makes them very similar to the carpetbaggers immediately after the American Civil War. These are the functional equivalents of the carpetbaggers. Whereas the exile that Edward Said as a Palestinian had in mind was the exile that brings the notion of home when he or she moves to the world. So he or she is connected to the world, is invested in the world, doesn't have this sort of dispensable, good for today and bad for tomorrow, or useless for tomorrow. Now, this notion of inorganic intellectual, or gun for hire, or native informer, or anything of that sort, is not something new in American history. I want to quote a passage for you from Tocqueville. Tocqueville, as you know, visited the United States in 1831 and 1832. And he wrote his famous book, Democracy in America, between 1835 and 1840. Now, this is just about a decade before Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto. The fantastic thing about Tocqueville is that he was not a Marxist. You know, he was in fact an aristocrat. But his observations about the United States and the way that it operates today, I mean, like 150 or 180 years after Tocqueville wrote, is absolutely astonishing. This is what Tocqueville says about nature of literature in the United States. Writing about the trade of literature in the America of his time, Tocqueville wrote, democracy not only infuses a taste for letters among the trading classes, but introduces a trading spirit into literature. For Tocqueville, a literary career and a careerism in literature becomes synonymous. Now I'm going to quote him. Among democratic nations, a writer may flatter himself that he will obtain at a cheap rate a moderate reputation and a large fortune. For this purpose, he need not be admired. It is enough that he is liked, the supreme bourgeois sentiment. The ever-increasing crowd of readers and their continual craving for something new ensure the sale of books that nobody much esteems. So far as your Amazon rate is cool, huh? In democratic times, the public frequently, this is the absolute masterpiece of this passage, in democratic times, the public frequently treat authors as kings do their courtiers. They enrich and despise them. What more is needed by the venal souls who are born in courts, who are worthy to live there? End of quote. Think of Azar Nafisi, Fawwaz Traboulsi, and Hershey Ali at the White House. Thank you.
In Iran since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. He has been a veteran of solidarity movements with the people of El Salvador and Nicaragua in the 1980s, involved in anti-apartheid struggles and the divestment campaigns from South Africa before the fall of the apartheid regime. He has been a regular contributor to the International Socialist Review and has written articles on the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian Reform Movement, and the geopolitics of oil. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Since we are talking about a connection between Iran and Lebanon, whether it's in the form of what happened this summer or in the form of some of the activists and people who are actually working here, I just want to go back and talk about, I was just thinking about this when people were speaking, talk about a little pamphlet that was published, I think in 1980 in Iran, which was called Civil War in Lebanon. And was put out, it doesn't matter, by a small left group in Iran. And it went out of print fairly quickly, I think in 1980 and a half, maybe 1981, when the forces of the Islamic Republic smashed all the left presses and you couldn't get it anymore. But the importance of it is that it actually captured, it was the memoirs of an Afghani immigrant worker, an illegal immigrant worker in Iran, who actually learned to read and write, reading left literature in Iran, and became part of the Iranian movement. And in that process actually traveled to Lebanon because actually many of the left groups in Iran had a connection with the Iranian, with the Lebanese left. And there were many of the people who actually fought in the, with the Lebanese national movement in the civil war at that time. At the time of the revolution, this person came back to Iran as part of the organization that he had joined, and ended up actually fighting a battle on the side of the Kurdish forces in Kurdistan and died. It really captures the circle of what the Mideast is and the Mideast politics is. And it stands really in the face of the Sunni-Shia divide that we're being sold today. That is the alternative to what the Washington is really selling us. And it is a real important part of the history of the Middle East that we really need to recapture. What I wanted to do is that I've been given the task of both talking about the regional politics, the macro, and the struggles, the micro, and it's a very difficult thing to do. So what I will do is I will try to actually throw out a number of concepts, do a kind of a sketch of a few things out there, and I hope you will forgive me for not going into details. Maybe we can pick up some of the themes. So let me start from the macro. Let me start with the idea of why Iran is central to the U.S. plans, why it is important. Of course, the one thing that pretty much everybody is familiar with is the question of oil, energy. Simply put, there are 4 countries, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, that have more oil under their soil than the rest of the world combined. Iran is second in oil reserves. It's also second in gas reserves. Second after Saudi Arabia in oil, second after Russia in gas. But the important thing is that Iran's importance actually goes beyond energy. It has played a central role in the region before, and it has actually started to play a central role in the region again. It has a large population, about 70 million, which is now very educated and technically adept. Actually, part of the problems of the regime is that we don't have enough graduate students. We have so many graduate students that most of them have to drive taxis to get by. It's a question of jobs, not the question of technical ability in Iran in a lot of cases, which makes it very tasty to American neoliberalism. It's got a developed infrastructure and it's got a fairly developed economy. Just to give you an idea, and I will put a lot of asterisks in terms of the numbers because there are severe distortions, and I will come back to this. If there is one thing to take away from the question of Iran, it is that without understanding contradiction, you cannot understand the society. Okay, so there are a number of asterisks. And it is actually that contradiction which is the engine of the dynamism of that society. Okay, so that's where I will give you just a couple of numbers in terms of giving you an idea of what I'm talking about in terms of being fairly developed. There are distortions, as I said, but Iranian economy right now is twice the size of the Egyptian economy. It is larger than Israel's in pure GDP numbers today. Okay, and this is after decades of really being isolated from the world economy. It is also trying to expand beyond oil. It had set up other joint ventures with France, Germany, Venezuela, China, India, and a whole host of other countries. But I think that the most important thing in terms of Iran's importance is political. Simply put, 1979, I think, was the second biggest defeat for U.S. imperialism, the first being Vietnam, in the past 50 years. This is despite the outcome of the revolution and who came into power. On pure terms, this was the second biggest defeat that the U.S. have had in the past 50 years. And also, Iran has become a focal point of resistance to U.S. domination, and now the attempt to remap the Middle East. It's become the biggest challenger to U.S. hegemony and Israeli hegemony through along with the U.S. And it's actually tried to develop ties to China, Russia, India, and Europe in that process. Iranian revolution really is something that the U.S. hasn't really completely recovered from, and if you look at it, it really was the beginning of a process that started the whole idea of containment through arming Iraq. Oops, double containment of Iran and Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait, which we really, and now with the invasion of Iraq, really, you can make the argument that they're trying to rewind the past 28 years to get back on a different footing, but to really get back to a position where Iran, which was a plus under the Shah and an asset for the U.S. and became a minus, a challenge to the U.S. would again become a plus, but on a different footing and the center of a new remapped, new liberal, free trade zone, free-for-all Middle East. That really is the process we're talking about, and why real men want to go back to Tehran is really about that. Let me take a few minutes and actually talk about the dynamics of the state itself, which was the same thing, the internal dynamics within Iraq. And it's important to talk about that because because when you actually go to the so-called Islamic societies, all of a sudden the political topography becomes completely flat. There is no difference. Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, it's all the same. It's all, presented by this myth of no cultural differences. There is the predominant Islam, which if you would actually scratch a little bit below the surface, and if you want to take the question of Taliban and, getting rid of the TV, on the other hand, you can actually look at Iran and the blossoming cinema that it produces, very different societies. Iranian state is still seen as through the face of the bearded, ominous face of Khomeini. Okay, and the reality of it, however, was that there were serious differences between classes. Class divisions that actually, until today, exist within Iranian society. The main grouping which actually took over after the revolution in Iran, and again I mentioned the brutality of it, were not necessarily the traditionalist stereotype. They were actually quite young, intellectual, technocratic people, technocratic and managerial types that wanted to put through a process of state planning to develop the country in agriculture. It's really what's seen in other third world countries, and people call it import substitution. That really was one way. There were the polar opposites, which were also the stereotype traditionalists. And they duked it out, sometimes on our heads, but they duked it out over those issues. There were other forces that within the process of 10 years probably traveled the 200-year from the bazaar all the way to the becoming people who ended up owning airlines and the pharmaceutical industry. Really, the 200-year process of capitalist development in Iran for some people in that process of the revolution to 10 years. Okay, this is really the basis of some of the stuff that actually the reform movement does, because you're creating serious contradictions within the Iranian society, serious contradictions that later, you go forward 10 years, you see the same lines. The people who were the import substitutionists not have actually adapted the market, process that you see in the third world, and want to open up the society to the outside. This also opens up a lot of the issues from below to come to the surface. I will give you one example, which is the question of women. Development of literacy, water projects, roads, communication in the early years of the revolution, specifically the literacy of women, which takes you from something about 30% literacy rates in the beginning of the revolution to 2000, about 97% of people who are 15 to 24 years old are literate. Okay, produces the situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran where 70% of the physics graduates out of the Azad University Tehran today are women. 63% of the women of students are women in the universities. Okay, 12% of the workforce are living. These are the contradictions. This is people, I think Hamid Dabashi talks about Iran being a gender apartheid. Yeah, but we have to remember that apartheid South Africa also produced some of the heroic struggles. That's the other side of it. Okay. Since I am running late, I want to say just a couple of things in terms of what that means for now. The process of reform was shut down in 2004. Okay. However, just a couple of lines to draw. Number one, the reformists, interestingly enough, were able to transform Iranian society and break it into the world market. If you look at between the numbers, the GDP numbers between 2000 and 2004, Iran's GDP went up from about 100 billion to 160 billion, a 60% increase. Okay? Foreign investment in Iran, which was minuscule, it was 32 million. I think this building might cost more than $32 million when they put it together. Foreign investment went up from 32 million to 500 million, which is small because also, again, distortions. There's a lot of joint ventures that are being done. There's a flood of capital into Iran, which also creates distortions and contradictions. Okay? And during the same period, and when Israel talks about Iran being an existential threat, it is not just about nuclear weapons. During the same period, 2000 to 2004, foreign investment in Israel went down from 5.1 billion to 1.7 billion. See where the money is going. Okay? Those are the issues. I will end with two things. War in Lebanon, two markers, which basically was not about the Shiite rising. The war in Lebanon, albeit briefly, actually captured the imagination of people fighting together. The Hezbollah, and because it has its own problems in terms of being a sectarian grouping, however, Hezbollah was being hailed in the Sunni streets of Egypt. Okay. It actually captured the imagination of the possibility of a political fight against Israeli-US hegemony, and that had to be stopped. Second marker, the Gulf Cooperation Council meeting January 15th, which seals the agreement of the moderate Arab states in terms of encircling Iran and unleashes the surge in Iraq to actually close off that. These are the two markers. One leads to the other. The victory in Lebanon actually forms an Arab Sunni, an Arab alliance, not against Israel, but an Arab alliance with Israel against Hezbollah and Iran. Okay, this is the terrain that today we're talking about, and I think that's where I want to leave it to actually discuss what we can do, because I think that there is more than just one avenue for the U.S. today to go down. And that avenue is not necessarily military. It is financial. It is what can happen in Iraq. It's a number of fronts that are being closed in. And the success that they're having today is actually on the financial, on the banking and the spectrum, where they're, even though they're not called sanctions, but they are actually suffocating Iran and taking away what we need inside Iran, political space.
Not leave us because, do these work? Can you hear me in the back? Because now we'd like to open this up to discussion, but before we do so, I'd like to say that Adalah, I think, is about to start passing around a basket. So please contribute what you can to help with expenses for today's event and future events. And I'd like to remind you to check the tables in the back after the event for literature from some of the co-sponsors. I want to turn it over to questions very fast because I'd like to have maximum time for it, but before I do so, I just would like to comment on a couple of things that I gathered here and issues that I think will continue to be important. One, Saman, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that the Iranian economy today is quite large. But I don't think that we can understand Iran's saber rattling today without understanding its dire economic straits. And I want to talk about this precisely because while the Democrats, some among them, may be pressing for airstrike on Iran less than some of the neocons might be, they are all united on sanctions and deepening sanctions on Iran. And over the past months, Nancy Pelosi, etc., they've all been very united on this, which actually could have disastrous consequences for Iran, which is in desperate need of foreign investment, from what I understand, to be able to develop its oil and gas reserves. So I'd like to bring a different spin on the oil question, because Iran's main export is oil and gas. Yet at the moment, it is underproducing because it does not have the technology, because of sanctions, to be able to produce at the levels it should be. And in fact, there was a recent article in January 2007 in the Proceedings of the National Academy, in which Stern, an economic geographer, delineates the drop in Iranian oil production. And moreover, argues that at this rate, Iranian exports will drop to zero by perhaps 2014. So this is a real crisis, and I think one possible and strong argument for, again, Iran's seemingly bellicose, uncompromising position is that, as Ervand delineated, they tried negotiating with the United States government through various channels, and they were rejected. So the conclusion that people are drawing in Iran domestically at various levels of government is that dialogue doesn't work. This dialogue of civilizations, Khatami style, what that got us is the axis of evil, is the label of the axis of evil. So they're pushing for a different strategy, which is making a lot of noise about Iran's nuclear program, hoping that this will result in the U.S. negotiating, which bleakly we're seeing that that's not happening. So this was just to bring in the question of Iranian's economy. Large, I think it's actually under an extreme amount of pressure. And Ervand, you said that the U.S. government is considering really two options, and one of them is actually not really considering negotiations. It's off. So what we're looking at is airstrikes. The very serious and real possibility of airstrikes, but I'd like to introduce into this discussion again the deepening sanctions, which could come along with the war, could prepare the path to war, but let us also remember that sanctions, not only as we saw in Iraq, lead the path to war, but are also war by other means. Which we saw that, again, not to forget that the Clinton administration administered the hardest sanctions regime in modern history. So we need a bit of historical perspective. And very last point to throw in is that we're hearing a lot of talk these days of Iran's violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there's been various and important articles written trying to see, how serious is Iran's violation of the NPT? Is it a violation? Is it in fact do its faulty reporting strategies constitute violations? So whatever one can conclude about Iranian violations of the NPT, one thing we should bear in mind, I think, as we organize resistance in this country against the expansion of the war, is the fact that actually the U.S. is violating all three of the main clauses of the NPT, which include the reducing of stockpiles. All 5 signatories of the NPT in 1968 promised to slowly reduce their nuclear stockpiles and have not done so. The NPT also has a stipulation that nuclear countries should not threaten non-nuclear countries who are signatories to the NPT. And of course, unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And also the NPT stipulates that nuclear powers facilitate the transfer of nuclear technology for peaceful use. And I don't mean to champion the NPT or the IAEI. I mean, these are not objective, neutral institutions. They have histories, and I think it's important to bear in mind that the IAEI actually was never against nuclear power. which arguably could always relate to nuclear energy for military purposes, but was actually about how to spread nuclear power, albeit peacefully. So some things to keep in mind, and hope that was pithy enough. And I'd like to take questions. And we have 2 microphones here. If we can just check by the first 2 questions, if you can perhaps just speak from where you are so we don't have to have these atrocious lines forming. So let's try that, and if not, maybe I can call on 3 people at a time. Please, ma'am.
My question is that the United States has a long history of covert operations in Iran, Iraq, a number of other countries. What can countries do about that? I mean, is the World Court involved? Is litigation? What can be done about the murders and assassinations that the United States carries out?
First question is, can people in the back hear that question? No? So either I could repeat it back, or we could go to the microphones. And the microphones, because the question was about U.S. covert operations and whether, and what can we do about U.S. covert operations. So that's number 1. And perhaps another second.
Okay. I would like to ask the panelists' take on the situation with the British naval people that have been captured by Iran. You know, I lived through the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which turned out to be a complete lie on the part of Washington. Now we have Bush's lapdog there, you know, saber rattling against Iran. What's the role of the U.S. in all of that? And what do the panelists make of it?
So I think after this, I am actually going to start asking for you to go to the microphones, because the questions are very beautifully put, and I don't want to make a mistake in putting them back. But the gentleman here is asking about the British captives, or the arrests of British by the Iranians, and what does this mean, and in light of the Gulf of Tonkin and similar situations in the past. Would you mind coming to the speaker?
Following up on that question, I'm sure people saw this week that the U.S. had major war games in the Persian Gulf, which were extensive operations with the new carrier groups that they've added to the region. I was just curious what the panelists think about that. On the one hand, it seemed like a large publicity stunt in that it was clearly played up by the Bush administration as a, you know, showing off their new muscle in the Persian Gulf. In that sense is perhaps just saber rattling, or and they had actually scaled back some of the war games in light of the hostages. On the other hand, I think we don't want to take lightly all of their threats, and it's very clear that, as the first speaker said, that they could very easily move into airstrikes. So I'm curious what the panelists have to say about some of the immediate possibilities for that.
And just a few more, if I could call on you to come. The lady in blue, please, if you wouldn't mind. You, sir, if you could jump in. Would you? Okay. Is it good? Perfect. Would you mind standing up? That's great.
2 questions. I have one from Professor Abrahamian. You mentioned that airstrikes. What do you think about the American condition in Iraq right now, not just physically in Iraq, but are they so busy mentally and also financially? And that still gives the opportunity to American to attack Iran. And one question for Saman. What do you think about the condition if this situation, that if Iran regime change that they mentioned, give the opportunity to more foreign investors to invest in Iran after regime change, that gives really bad condition to Israelis. Do you think that can make Israelis to not think about this?
Did everyone hear that in the back? More or less? Yes? Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to let the panel to respond to some of these questions and comments. Who would like to regarding?
Actually, a number of the questions sort of tie up to this, or link together, in that if the U.S. is planning on airstrikes, It's hard to go to American public and say, yeah, we're going to airstrike next month or so on. But the strategy would be, of course, to increase tensions. And the way to increase tensions is, one, to have military maneuvers, send in covert operations, basically up the ante. There are other incidents already in the last few months, like arresting Iranians in Iraq. U.S. has explicitly accused Iran of being responsible for American military personnel being killed. These are, I think, all basically quite coordinated ways of increasing tensions. And I would imagine if you try to increase tensions, then you expect the other side to either back down, expect Iran to say, well, we'll give up the nuclear project, we'll do whatever we want. But the other alternative is the other side would also try to push the envelope. And I think the thinking in Washington is one way of getting airstrikes is to increase tensions, and the other side will fall into the trap of actually then also increasing tensions, playing chicken with the United States. And so far, the Iranians seem to be falling into that trap. So the rest of the British would very much fall into that. I wouldn't be surprised sooner or later there'll be some shootouts between Iranian diplomats and in Iraq. Iraq is a very dangerous place. You have to have guns, you can't walk around, and you don't know who's shooting you. So sooner or later they might shoot Americans. And that would really create a good environment for the U.S. then to say we're carrying out defensive airstrikes. It would be, for those who are old enough will remember Tonkin Gulf resolution type of thing. So I think it is very much part of the scheme. That's why I don't think they're in a hurry, because these tensions could, go on for months. If you have a timetable towards the end of your administration, you still have some time to do it. But it all actually basically relies on Iranians playing for the game. And I think they're lucky there. Ahmadinejad is stupid enough to fall into the trap. There are, in fact, people like Rafsanjani and Khatami who have made statements that they have to be very careful and not fall into the trap. But it's not quite clear who's going to run policy. But of course, once you get in a situation where it's national honor, national reputation, it's easier to up the ante rather than try to cool things down. And I think already in terms of covert operations, this has been going on now for about 6 months. There have been a lot of bombings in the Kurdish areas, in the Arab areas, in Baluchistan. There are even radio stations in America inciting ethnic violence in Iran. It's quite openly done, but it's probably financed by the US government. So these are all part of the scheme. And there's not much Iran can do in terms of going to the international court or so on. You have to get direct evidence. And that they're careful enough not to do it. And often, actually, the U.S. doesn't do it directly. They do it through the Israelis and the British, and then through various front organizations like things like Kurdish Liberation or Baluchi Liberation or Arab Liberation Fronts or some things like that. So these are all already in the works. Financial. I don't think the costs of American finances are going to deter Bush from attacking Iran, in that already U.S. is spending trillions in Iraq, so a few billions in Iran is not going to make much difference. Anyways, the future generation is going to pay for it. It's not the Bush administration. So I don't think the cost would be a deterrence in terms of preventing an airstrike on Iran.
Just to add a couple of points to what Ervand said, activities have been going on, war games have been going on. And to me, there is no way for us to really know whether or not the United States will or will not attack. The only sort of semi-reliable information that we have is from Seymour Hersh's articles that consistently has been telling us that in fact the US is getting ready to attack. But being suspicious of everything, I even think that Seymour Hersh, with all my respect and admiration for him, even he might be used by PSYOP operations within the Pentagon. But I think, to me, as I said recently in an article, more important than will the United States attack or not attack is the state of war that is generated and sustained. It is in that state of war that the calamity and mayhem that the Bush administration has generated and sustained in Iraq is glossed over. According to a recent estimate, last year, 655,000 people were killed in the aftermath of US-led invasion of Iraq. We need, in this society, in this country, we need a process of truth and reconciliation. We need to hold people who lie systematically, consistently to the Congress, to American people about weapons of mass destruction, connection to Al-Qaeda, etc. Hold them responsible. I mean, while we need to go back with what happened in Iraq, we keep anticipating, will they attack Iran or not? This is the psychopathology of the situation. So rather than waiting to see when the next shoe will drop, will or will it not, which after all I don't think is even in the immediate control of the Bush administration. We are in an election year. I'm absolutely convinced that within the Republican Party there are now conversations how, for example, a potential invasion attack on Iran is going to affect the next election or the chances of the Republicans to, given the midterm election results that we recently had. The same is with the Islamic Republic of Iran. As one just said, Ahmadinejad is not in total control. Many people inside Iran are not thinking in post-Khamenei scenario. What will happen? There is an infighting between a faction led by Rafsanjani and a faction led by Misbah Yazdi, which sort of now is in on the position of the supreme leader. Is the position going to be upheld and sustained the way Misbah Yazdi wants, or is it going to be totally eliminated and replaced by the Expediency Council, the way that Rafsanjani would probably prefer? So there are two uncertainties that are in play. But what is for sure, should an invasion of any sort happen, which to me, what Israel did to Lebanon over the summer is the sort of a scenario that I think the United States will follow should an invasion of Iran happen, is going to make even Iraq, with the mayhem that it has caused, look like a Sunday picnic. Everybody talks about, for example, Iranians are all dissatisfied with the Islamic Republic, they couldn't wait for it to change. Some of the statistics that someone was giving about the university students, it is imperative to keep in mind that, for example, in 1997, when 3 million high school graduates participated in the national entrance examination, the entire capacity of the Iranian university system was only 240,000, namely less than 10% of the high school graduates, which means more than 90% of the high school graduates pour into the streets, no hope, no training, nothing. And they are absorbed into 3 levels of militarized poverty, the Pasdaran, the Basij, and the Hezbollah. These are the poorest possible layers of Iranian society, those who were entirely disenfranchised by Rafsanjani's presidency and couldn't care less about Khatami's dialogue of civilization. And these are the constituency that 15 million of them voted for Ahmadinejad in the last presidential election, and they are the ones that will stay and fight. These are not Gucci revolutionaries who sort of talk about, yes, let's United States come and liberate Iranians. These are facts on the ground, and while we wait to see whether or not US will invade, I think we have to keep our gaze steady on those responsible for the atrocities in Iraq, namely those who systematically lied and led us.
the audience? No? Oh, yeah, fantastic. I see back there a familiar face.
Yeah.
Could you stand?
Sure.
And I will repeat it. If people don't hear the question, just tell me. I'll repeat that.
But it seems to be missing a sort of a consistent basis in all these discussions. What the last speaker mentioned was the social dynamics within the societies within Iraq. For instance, just 2 weeks ago, practically all teachers in Iraq were on strike. And tens of them were arrested, and there was a big campaign to get them free. Before that, on the 8th of March, you had this massive, not massive in the sense that millions came out, but you had hundreds and thousands of women, again, throughout Iran came out and were arrested, and this can happen again every March, all over. Before that, you had these students in Tehran, the university, with banners saying, their slogan was bread, justice, socialism, or barbarism, Persian, Socialist, Adalah-NY, which point out to the highly advanced culture that they've been able to preserve under the Islamic Republic. So I think at some point it would do good to pay attention to all these social movements, which were, after all, the one responsible for moving through the Shah. And same thing happened to the Islamic Republic. And I think it would be good to.
Fantastic. So the gentleman in the back is basically talking about the very important point of the need to pay attention to social movements inside of Iran and think of what solidarity with social justice, conscientious people advocating for social justice inside of Iran look like, really, with those of us with similar visions here.
I think one aspect of the situation is domestic politics here, is that the mainstream of the anti-war movement that does exist has allowed itself to let the Democratic Party define the limits of the possible. And so orientation toward Congress and lobbying. And if you actually look at the statements of people like Obama, his argument has been precisely that we've got to get out of Iraq sometime or other because we've been neglecting Iran. And this is also true of Nancy Pelosi and the whole Democratic Party leadership. And I think we'd have a much better, more independent and powerful anti-war movement if we weren't limiting our perspective to the Congress and the Democrats.
I'm going to use the mic. I have a question for Professor Abrahamian. You mentioned in your evaluation of the kind of scenarios in the event of an attack on airstrikes on Iran, you mentioned the fact that Iran had in some ways over the past 3 years, I think you said, helped stabilize to some extent Iraq and Afghanistan for the US. And I just wanted to ask you to kind of, and you mentioned that this could be reversed in certain ways, which would wreak havoc for the American presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this seems to be a point that is kind of comes up a lot of times by Arab commentators who are very much opposed to Iran's influence in the region. I was wondering if you can explain a little more exactly how Iran helped stabilize or what it did in Iraq and Afghanistan in the sort of limited time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the critics of Iran sort of make a big leap from saying, well, Iran and the US basically had parallel policies to the point that Iran is therefore working hand in glove with the United States. I think they had common interests in both countries. Iran actually was quite happy to see the end of Taliban. They'd almost gone to war with the Taliban. They were quite happy to see the end of Saddam Hussein, since they fought 8 years with Saddam Hussein. So when US got rid of those two regimes, they had no reason to oppose it. Once the regimes went, Iran then had actually decided in Afghanistan it was in Iranian interest to have a stable government in Kabul. So they put pressure on the Northern Alliance to work with Karzai to establish the Kabul government. And there's no secret about that. In that period, in fact, the U.S. and State Department, the Iranian government, Foreign Office and State Department were working in Geneva to get a government there that would be stable. Now, I wouldn't say that U.S. Was using Iran. It was mostly Iran using the United States mutual interest. In Iraq, similarly, it was once Saddam Hussein fell, it was in Iran's interest to have elections in Iraq because elections they knew which would bring to power Sukiri and Dawa, which were two parties that were closely allied to Iran. In fact, I think that this is where, I don't know if the Iranians were more closer to knowledge, information, or it was more, it turned out that way. But the U.S. strategy in Iraq was not initially to have elections, but to go in and put Chalabi there. And their idea, and here they were actually using the Sunni-Shia card already before the invasion. The neocons were saying, well, we'll go in and set up what they said was a secular liberal. I don't know why they like secular liberal, so it's in America, that's, from their point of view, that's the worst thing they did. For Iraq, that was considered the best secular liberal, which would be Shia, basically politicians like Alawi and Chalabi. But once they got to Baghdad, they discovered actually reality was very different. This is where I think the shit hit the fan as far as Washington is concerned. And there's one incident which now the rewriting of the history of the incident is never brought in by Packard people, which is 2 weeks after the invasion, there was a demonstration called by the major ayatollahs in Karbala. And if you go to the Financial Times, you'll see what happened there. The Times wrote how they came in thousands, they came in 10,000s, they came in the millions. And they said the whole scene was very disturbing. And once that basically was cleared that the people in the street were not following Chalabi, but following the Shia ayatollahs, things began to unravel, because then you had that U.S. position was, are they going to shoot these millions of people in the street, or are they going to go along with Sistani and Shia ayatollahs? And they wisely decided they might as well go along with the Sistani and the ayatollahs. In fact, the U.S., when it went to Iraq, already had a constitution for Iraq. But Sistani said, thank you very much, we'll write our own constitution. So democracy really began with the demand of the Shia ayatollahs. And for Iran, why should they object? They probably realized if you had elections, it would be Sukiri and Dawa who would win. Actually, the loose cannon there was Sadr, because Sadr was anti-Iranian, and he got much more support than they expected. But Sadr has really no choice but to rely on Iran. So it very much, Iran is pursuing its own interest, not U.S. interest. And the Arab commentators who sort of criticize Iran, they should have criticized U.S. more before the invasion. If the Saudis don't like what's happening, why weren't they more forthright in opposing the invasion in the first place?
Would you mind coming to the mic since you're right there?
My name is Mustafa, and I'm originally from Egypt. If you look at the Middle East, it could look very depressing. If you look at the destruction in Iraq, the siege of Palestine, you know, the possibility of war in Iran. But I think at the same time, some of the speakers began to touch on it, especially Dabashi and Saman. There is actually great hope and great potential for mass democratic movements in the area. comrade in the back spoke about strikes in Iran. Same thing is actually happening in Egypt. There's been a wave of strikes in the last couple of months in the textile factories, and it's very interesting. At one point, the men workers, the majority of workers are women, the men workers hesitated to go out on strike again. So the women, actually all of them are veiled, walked out on strike and chanted, "Where are the men, where are the men?" Forced the men to come out on strike. And then there was a discussion at about 1 o'clock in the morning. A lot of the men were trying to convince the women to go home to their families, and the women said, "No, absolutely not." And eventually, but it gives you a sense that something is happening, I think, in the Middle East. People touched upon it. 20 years ago, the U.S. had the support of the majority of ordinary Arabs in the Middle East. People believed in the Washington Consensus, believed in neoliberalism, had hoped that this is going to improve their lives. Today, actually, all these hopes are thrown out of the window, and what's happening in Palestine and Iraq is making people more and more angry, actually. It's a good word to use sometimes. And the resistance in Iraq and Palestine is having a very interesting dynamic. It's giving people confidence to stand up to those Arab regimes. To the point where the Saudi king, who is just one of the most conservative, backward people on earth, could sound like Chavez, saying that the U.S. needs to get out of the Middle East. I mentioned this, and I want to end on one thing, which is the urgency of building the anti-war movement here. Troops out of Iraq now, no attacks on Iran, because we give space actually for those movements in the Middle East to develop. If they develop there, actually that's going to help us here against our own anti-democratic government. If I can end on a small personal story. I grew up in Egypt, but I was half Iranian, and my mother and my father didn't like each other, and my mother always called me Little Khomeini right after the revolution. We're just like, there was anti-Shia hysteria that Iran wanted to take over the world, and you're just like your grandmother, she's Adalah Khomeini. Today, I go back to Egypt 20 years later, it's very interesting. I was there last October. The pictures in all the coffee shops with the Shia man, Hassan Nasrallah. And people really begin to actually questioning, what is Shiism? It's been demonized forever. People are reading about Shiism and see that actually these divisions are very superficial. So that's the hope actually in the Middle East.
I'd like to take a couple more, and in fact, I know that Fawwaz would like to respond to some of the things on the floor among other people in the panel. So the lady in the front, please, and the mic's right there.
One of the speakers mentioned Iranian GDP that was improved 60%. I wanted to ask you about the GDP since Ahmadinejad took office, and also how his comments in reference to his comments and his conferences in reference to Israel, existence of Israel, has affected British and U.S. policy and recent. And also one more thing, what are you guys to emphasize on Saudi Arabia's foreign policy in reference to Iran and this whole issues with Ahmadinejad?
Thank you. A few more, please. The gentleman has had his hand, and the lady in the back, if you could come down to the mic behind him.
In the late 1970s, as many people in the audience are probably aware, especially if you listen to Taking Aim on WBAI, the Israeli Mossad developed a plan for Israel for the 1980s to dismantle various Arab and Middle Eastern states into smaller units a la Yugoslavia. And I just want to pose the question, what do you think of the next decade or so? Do you think this dismantling of large Arab or Middle Eastern regimes into smaller, mini-states or large Bantustans could take place, and what would that mean for economic dominance in the Middle East?
My question might be somewhat related, because it seems like there's been something of a turn in U.S. policy toward the Arab resistance in terms of starting civil wars in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Iraq, as a means of control. And it doesn't seem as though it's exactly the same as the divide and conquer, where there's a picking of a side and the elevation of that side. And just in trying to apply, how would that policy actually look at, well, you're looking at Iran, because there is a number of different cross currents in Iran, reform movement, class struggle, but if they're trying to push back Iran from a position where it's actually increased its prestige and power in the region, it doesn't seem like they have an end game. Like they want to reduce its influence, but can they actually go for complete regime change? And what would that mean? Who would they turn to? Because it seems like the people who are increasing their relationships with sections of Iran and Iranian capital aren't American. And so does that actually destabilize it further against the U.S. if they go for all-out regime change?
And on that note, I'd actually like to turn it to Fawwaz.
Yeah, I've got a few comments. To start taking the cue from Hamid, let me remind you, I mean, I also admire Seymour Hersh, but in a few months he's given two theories. One about the attack on Iran, and the other is the redirection about what I tried to talk about concerning mainly civil strife and emphasizing moderates against extremists, but more clearly Sunnis against Shiites. It's not to the discredit of Seymour Hersh, but I think Seymour Hersh really channels inside information. But what I think he reveals is the fact that for the first time since the neocons departed partially from the scene, there is a confused policy vis-à-vis the region in Washington. And I think we wouldn't understand much if we take just one conjunctural episode and judge on the basis of it, which makes me emphasize the fact that there is the strategy of preparing for war, and there's the strategy of creating an Arab Sunni and an Arab Israeli front against Iran. They are not the same. But let me answer a question concerning first Saudi Arabia. I mean, we should reintroduce one aspect of the whole issue, and that's the fear in the Gulf as regards an American military operation against Iran, because the Gulf has got two major American bases, and definitely those major American bases are going to be hit. And we're talking about Qatar, and we're talking about Bahrain, not to speak about some remaining servicing in Saudi Arabia. So to start with, you have this problem, which has in a way affected Saudi policy. Now the other thing, I think also you should be aware of the fact that concerning Iraq, there is no big problem between Iran and the United States, except what has appeared recently, and that is the fact that since Maliki was brought to power, there has been a very shy policy of opening up to the Sunni insurgency. This is the beginning of the problem, and it is in a way putting more and more pressure on especially Muqtada al-Sadr and his militias. If you follow the recent events, you're going to discover that this Baghdad operation is mainly encouraging Sunni operations against Shiite neighborhoods. So there is a budding difference concerning this very shy, covert, confused policy that was supposedly adopted 2 years ago, which was called reconciliation in Iraq, and which was supposed to bring in the military insurgency, at least the Ba'athi military insurgency, into the political process. So Saudi Arabia, when the king of Saudi Arabia, talks shyly of the of American invasion or occupation in Iraq, and for the last 3 days, Washington is still trying to do the same, translating and asking, did he say that or didn't he? I mean, it's just the same story. That what one should read it, at least what I suppose one should read it, is the following. He's saying, I am the one who should, Saudi Arabia is the one who should represent the Sunnis of Iraq and not Syria. That's there is a discussion with Syria concerning the insurgency in Iraq, more than there is any fantastic role to be played by Iran concerning Iraq. So now the big question is, two questions. The first question, I think we have this habit of considering wars as being predetermined. We don't discuss whether we should avert wars. So the one big question is, should this war be averted? I mean, should the Iranian leadership simply slip into the war, starting from the British Navy men, the British crew, to end up in a crisis that would lead to war? At least in the region, we have this misfortune of having, of looking at wars as if they're predetermined and as if they are, there's no way to avert them. Saddam Hussein left us this legacy that, I mean, you go to war and you're sure that the Americans are going to have a war. So there's no way to discuss whether you can avert a war. I mean, people thought that, I mean, after having taken over Kuwait, he could have simply left Kuwait and see what the US would do. The man, now we discover that Mr. Bush was lying concerning weapons of mass destruction. If he was lying, Saddam knew that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Could Saddam have averted that last war or not, is a question that should be. And I think it's our duty to also ask the question, has the Iranian leadership any role to play in averting this war? I'm not calling for bowing down to US pressure or to US diktats, but I'm just reminding you. One question we are not addressing is, if there were negotiations, what are the issues? What does the US want from Iran? Only to destroy its nuclear capacity? I mean, I think it is worth more discussion to understand what is at stake.
Which makes us focus on all the details and the hows and the whats and the possibilities, rather than a broader picture of actually what are the reasons. I'm actually even more critical of the last article he wrote, Redirection, because if you actually read it carefully, he starts to read back the Sunni-Shia divide historically back into some of there are a few statements in there. So you actually, since he's actually reading the information, you almost get a sense that the Sunni-Shia divide is something which has been there all along, which actually feeds the tribalist argument. Okay, I can show you the quote. Yeah, there are quotes in there that actually reads it back. Anyway, that's aside the point. The second thing I wanted to talk about is about the question of regime change. See, the project started with regime change. Yes, they did want to go back to pre-1979, but we live in a real world. Okay, there is the debacle of Iraq. There are things that have happened which make them have to come up with contingency plans and deal with what actually goes on, you know, in this situation. They have to put up with real people in this country, working class people who are sacrificing life and limb, and you know, they don't fight the wars. Working class people in this country fight it. What's happening in the army here, the possibilities of, you know, how much pressure you're going to put first, second, third, fourth. Okay, on the other hand, they didn't see what was going to happen within Iraq. There are realities that they have to adjust, and I think that there are contingencies that are being made. About Israel, somebody asked, you know, doesn't this mean more, you know, when they change their regime? Let's not jump the gun. I actually think that they have changed their thinking and are thinking of containment, if you want to put on it, for the time being. Okay, that's why, going back to something that Lady talked about, the question of sanctions. See, I think that the stuff that they're doing is actually worse than sanctions, because it's stealth sanctions. The financial stuff that's going on in the banking system right now, which says we will not process Iran's transfers. What does that mean? Can Iran go to China and say, here, pay me in cash and oil, I'm going to go to Germany and buy goods? Doesn't work. So actually you completely clog up any sort of, without going through the UN, IAEA, bypassing the whole mess of other messy situations, you can completely shut down the economy over a period of time. Okay, so the question of the financial pressures that are being applied on Iran outside of the sanctions is something that people should pay attention to through the banking system. That is not the be-all and end-all. It is something that's working for them. They'll go with it as long as it works. Are they going to attack? Well, if they have an opportunity, maybe they will, if they've got a better card to play. When will they do it? When it's advantageous to them. I think that that's how we have to think about the different ways of actually how they are dealing with it. And finally, in terms of the question of apprehension over in the Gulf, from the Gulf states that Fawwaz was speaking, this is also true of some of the other countries. Yes, there is apprehension on the part of China and Russia for a war, but also China and Russia, you have to remember, actually have a relationship which do not necessarily want too much independence out of Iran, and Iran dragging them into a situation which gets out of their hand. China and Russia do not want a fight with the US at this time. Okay? And that's why they have actually gone along with some of the things to some of the sanctions to basically cut down Iran to size, if not necessarily go along with everything.
Yeah, just a couple of points. One about the social movements that our friends was mentioning, also Majid indicated in Iran. Of course, there are multifaceted social movements in Iran and in the rest of the region. And most, particularly in Iran, women's rights movements. But the problem with these movements is the minute that the United States comes out and endorses them, they lose credibility. They are turned into, it's like a Sicilian kiss of death. The minute that you endorse them, one of the incarcerated activists, women's rights activists in Iran has recently written an absolutely magnificent letter, open letter addressed to the former Queen of Iran, in which she says, just leave us alone. Who the hell are you? Of course, in a more polite language. To send us a message about our rights and our struggles. You follow? So the best thing is just for the United States, particularly the so-called human rights organization, just to stay the hell out of these affairs. The other thing concerning the dismantling of countries such as Iran, the most favorite objective of Bernard Lewis, well, as everybody knows, these nation-states are the product of colonial history anyway. But whatever sectarian or ethnic tensions exist for secessionist movements, there are also others, sort of a massive history, 200 years of socialist revolutionary experiences also in these societies. And the way that they are being abused, as Ervand mentioned, in terms of Kurdish and Azeri and Arab separatist movements, the question is, suppose Khuzestan secedes and becomes yet another sheikh like Bahrain. So what's the point? Whereas within the context of however colonially manufactured Iranian territory proper, there are much more possibilities of cosmopolitan revolutionary resistances which doesn't degenerate into sectarian movements. One final point about this notion of Sunni Shi'i. The principal theorist, the strategist of that language in this country is Sayyid Badi Reza Nasr, and his most recent book on this Shi'i revival. A scholar who began with a half-decent scholarly credentials and now works and teaches at a military academy. And the argument of Sunni Shi'i bifurcation is wonderful, because the way it shifts the emphasis is that, as Fawwaz Ajami has put it, the gift of foreigners, with American foreign policy was bringing the gift of freedom to Iraqis, but these people don't get it. They are so divided along medieval lines and Sunni-Shi'i divides that they don't deserve it. So what Reza Nas has done is diversive the question of blame. Who began the war on March 21st, 2003 with a massive project of shock and awe, and all the mayhem that resulted? Oh yes, this is a Sunni-Shi'i. Well, the British had the Protestant and Catholics in Ireland. The British, they invented colonialism. They had Hindu and Muslim in India. And as Nicholas Dirks, our distinguished colleagues at Columbia, has just put a fantastic book on the history of caste. Not that these divisions didn't exist, but these divisions are always agitated by external political factors. And in this specific case, in a recent interview after the bombing of the 11th Imam in Iraq, an interview asked me, so what is the matter with them Shiis and Sunnis? Why are they? I said, listen, the expression shock and awe is English. It's not Arabic. It's not Persian. It's not Shi'i. It's not Sunni. Begin with the term shock and awe, plain English, out of Washington, inside the Beltway. And that will go a long way explaining what happens to a society, to a country, to a polity, when you unleash so much violence before you come to a point that you need some extra explanations of what the Sunnis and Shiis are concerned. But this has been, this Reza Nas books has been introduced in a very strategic moment that now US can withdraw and say, oh, sorry, we try to bring them Arabs democracy, but they don't deserve it, this medieval Sunni-Shi'i nonsense. So thank you very much.
Actually, if you don't mind giving me this piece of paper, because there's a photo in the front, well, you can't quite see, but this is Adalah-NY, the woman who, I don't know if you can see in the back, who Hamid mentioned, and actually some colleagues translated this from Farsi into English, very eloquently written. And I think one of the things to bear in mind, again, going back to Majid in the back and this question of solidarity, is with social justice activists inside of Iran, and how do we stand in solidarity with them, and frankly learn from them is exemplified by her. I think you're absolutely right, because here you have someone who opposes the repressive tactics of the Iranian government and stands up and speaks against them, and her colleagues with great sacrifice, but yet always condemns US war crimes. And not only that, she does something very radical in the Iranian context, which she talks about the history of repression of the Iranian Communist Party, you know, and she does it, and if you look at the photo, she's a woman who wears hijab, right, and I want to bring that up here because I was just at the Left Forum recently on a panel on Iran, and some of the panelists were really dividing the Iranian social movements on secular religious divides, and it's not that this divide doesn't exist. But if you look, and it also gets, I think, exaggerated in the American context, where American activists can look for secular-looking, democratic, socialist-speaking sort of counterparts in the Middle East with which they can stand in solidarity. But Adalah-NY shows that the scene there is more complicated. So let's think carefully about it. Let's expand our imaginations about what solidarity is. This is an exciting audience. I can't believe we ran out of time, but very last thing. I promised to read this, and it's the very end. Is the person who wants to talk about theater still here? Yes, there's a collaborative theater production between Israeli and Iranian.
I just want to talk about all of our work was talking about this problem that happened in the past year at State College up in Albany, New York. We have both Israeli playwrights, American playwrights, and Iranian. And now we have a play called Benedict. This is the Israeli project, which will open in the 20th in Albany and will transfer to Sundance Festival in Utah in July. and then San Francisco in September. I would like everybody to check the website, siena.edu, and if you could make the trip. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. One last announcement is that if people want to hang out, get a drink, get some food, there's a Irish pub restaurant around the corner, and we have reservations for about 20 or 40 people, so feel free to make your way there. It's called O'Reilly's, and it's on 35th Street between